Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Todd. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever engaged in negative self-talk? If you're like most of us, you have. How can we overcome this negative way of speaking to ourselves? Well, that's the question we're going to answer in this episode of Thinking Christianly. Before we answer our question, let me remind you to go ahead and hit the like button down at the bottom. Also, if you want to make sure that you don't miss future episodes, click on the subscribe button as well. Well, negative self-talk is not just a problem you have. It's a problem we all have. I think of Bible characters such as Mephibosheth, and although the king sought him out and sought to adopt him, Mephibosheth called himself nothing more than a dead dog. Well, like Mephibosheth, many of us tell ourselves negative things all the time. And this negative self-talk then affects our moods and alters our feelings. So if we're going to manage this negative self-talk, if we're going to overcome this negative self-talk, there's some things we need to do. And first, we need to recognize the type of negativity that we tend to practice. Then we need to take some positive steps to change the direction of our self-conversation. Now, here are 4 types of negative self-talk. You need to figure out which type of negative self-talker you are or you tend to be, and then you can do something about it. First, I would say that the first negative self-talker is what I would call the worrier. Those who engage in this type of self-talk tend to struggle with anxiety. The worrier thrives to speak in a way that always paints the worst case scenario possible. There's often this hope that by thinking in worst case terms, or in the bleakest of terms, the person will somehow be prepared to face any setback. Of course, most of the time, the worst case scenario never happens, and the worrier gets anxious without good reason. So that's the first type. The second negative self-talker is the critic. This person consistently puts himself or herself down. They promote a low self-image. They think that they can never do anything right. They're prone to struggle with excessive and needless shame. So in addition to those first two, the third negative self-talker is what we would call the victim. This person continually feels oppressed or taken advantage of. He or she tends not to take responsibility for themselves, and they usually blame their problems on someone or something outside of themselves. These folks also tend to think themselves into what I would call needless depression. And that brings up the last kind of self-talker, and that's what I'm going to call the negative self-talker. The negative self-talker is what I would call the perfectionist. The perfectionist is the critic. Let me put it this way. The best way to say this is that the perfectionist is the critic that we mentioned earlier, except he or she's a critic with a higher sense of self-esteem. The perfectionist lives life with I must or I should constantly falling from their lips. Perfectionists are constantly having a battle with chronic stress and burnout because of the unbelievably impossible standards they set for themselves. So what does all this mean? Well, once you figure out what type of negative self-talker you are, You can then do some things to renew your mind and change your perspective. One of the things I found helpful is to keep a thought record. List out your negative thoughts one by one. Be as concrete and as specific as you can be. Next, examine both the evidence for and the evidence against that kind of the truthfulness. Let me put it that way. Examine the evidence of whether or not the thought you have is truthful or not. There will be evidence for it and evidence against it. Remember, you've got to recall which kind of self-talker you tend to be, because that will help you be aware of where you may be skewing your view as you analyze the thought that you're having. Then after analyzing the evidence for, so you've listed out your thought. Let me back up. You have a pretty good idea of how you tend to jade things based on the kind of negative self-talker you are. That's first. Then as you encounter a situation, you start to experience anxious thoughts, negative thoughts. You list those very concretely and specifically. Then, after you do that, you examine the evidence for that would support the truthfulness of that belief or that thought. And then you examine the evidence that would go against that thought or belief. And after you do those things, after analyzing the evidence related to the validity of the thought, then you can list a more realistic thought in its place. You can put off the anxious thought, and you could put on the more realistic, and by definition then, the more godly thought. For instance, what does God say in His Word about this troublesome thought? How does He speak truth into your current struggle? What is He calling you to do in light of this truth? Make it a priority then, after you fill out that fourth column, to exercise your more realistic thought in a practical way. For example, let's say that I tend to be a victim. I have just found out that I didn't do well on an exam. Well, I'm feeling anxious. I feel like I'm a failure, and I'm feeling angry at my teacher. How do I deal with this negative feeling? Well, first, I list out my anxious thought. Since I tend to be a victim, I admit to myself that I have a tendency to blame others for my mistakes. So I list a thought like maybe something like, the teacher doesn't like me, and that is why I got a bad grade. Second, I investigate the evidence for and against this belief. I talk to some friends and find out they didn't do well either. I also talked to some other friends who did well, and I find out that they studied several more hours than I did. I also admit the fact that the teacher is always available to me and that she's consistently one of the most popular teachers in our school. Well, third, I conclude, after examining the evidence both for and against, I conclude that the reason I failed the test was that I didn't put enough time into studying. So my adjusted thought might be something like this. I didn't do as well as I could have on the test. However, this test does not mean I'm a failure, because God's Word says I'm more than a conqueror. Fourth, with this newfound way of thinking, I then go to my teacher and I ask her how to better prepare for the next exam. The teacher, impressed with how much I've grown and how I've expressed this desire to learn, responds in a positive manner. And she goes out of her way to help me. Do you see how this works? You slow things down. You understand your own tendencies. You evaluate your situation. You investigate your thinking. Then you reframe those thoughts. And after all that, you act on that new way of thinking by doing something productive behaviorally that implements that new thought. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions or would like to suggest any future questions for me to entertain, please let me know. Leave them in the comments section. I'd be glad to take a look at them. Until next time, God bless. We'll talk again soon.